Think you know everything about this cult horror classic? From cursed cast members and recycled puppet parts to a director who cast his own parents and a soundtrack that outsold the movie, Tales from the Hood harbors some genuinely bizarre secrets that even die-hard fans have never heard. Prepare to discover the twisted truth behind one of the 90s most socially conscious horror films. Fact 1. Rosalind Cash's tragic final performance. When Tales from the Hood hit theaters in May of 1995, audiences had no idea they were witnessing the final performance of a truly remarkable actress. Rosalind Cash, who played the mysterious Dr. Cushing in the film's brutal hardcore convert segment, was already battling cancer during production, though she kept her illness private from most of the cast and crew. Cash had built an impressive career spanning over 3 decades, with her most famous role being the female lead opposite Charlton Heston in the 1971 science fiction classic, The Omega Man. She was also well known to soap opera fans for playing Mary May Ward on General Hospital from 1994 until her death. Throughout her career, Cash was known for refusing to take stereotypical roles, instead choosing parts that showcased her range and dignity as an actress. In Tales from the Hood, Cash portrayed Dr. Cushing, the sinister scientist who subjects gang member Crazy K to experimental rehabilitation therapy that becomes increasingly nightmarish. Her performance was chilling and authoritative, showing no signs of the illness that was consuming her behind the scenes. The role required her to deliver complex dialogue about psychological conditioning and violence, which she handled with her characteristic professionalism and intensity. Tragically, Cash died of cancer on October 31, 1995, just over 5 months after Tales from the Hood was released. The timing was particularly haunting since she passed away on Halloween, making her final horror film role feel almost prophetic. She was only 56 years old and had been posthumously nominated for an Emmy Award for her work on General Hospital. Her death added an unexpected layer of poignancy to Tales from the Hood, as viewers realized they were watching not just a horror performance, but also a final farewell from a talented actress who had spent her career breaking barriers and refusing to compromise her artistic integrity. Fact 2. The cursed film theory. Some horror fans have developed a haunting theory that Tales from the Hood might be cursed, pointing to the tragic deaths of 2 cast members as evidence of supernatural bad luck surrounding the production. While most film scholars dismiss this as coincidence, the timing and circumstances of these deaths have certainly raised eyebrows among superstitious viewers. The curse theory began taking shape when Rosalind Cash died just months after the film's release, but it gained real momentum 10 years later when Lamont Bentley, who played the violent gang member Crazy K, died in a horrific car accident in 2005. Bentley was only 31 years old when he lost control of his vehicle on Highway 118 in Ventura County, California. His car went through a stop sign, crashed through a chain-link fence, and rolled down an embankment, ejecting him onto the freeway where he was struck by at least 5 different vehicles. The tragic irony wasn't lost on fans that Bentley's character in the film was also involved in deadly street violence, leading some to wonder if there was a connection between his fictional fate and his real-life death. Online forums and horror movie websites began documenting these deaths as potential evidence of a curse, with some fans drawing parallels to other supposedly cursed films like The Omen or Poltergeist. However, when examined more closely, the curse theory falls apart pretty quickly. The film had dozens of cast and crew members, and losing 2 people over the span of 10 years, while certainly tragic, isn't statistically unusual for any large group of people. Director Rusty Cundiff, producer Spike Lee, and stars like Clarence Williams III, David Alan Grier, and Corbin Burnson all went on to have long, healthy careers after the film. Most film historians agree that the curse theory is simply a case of fans looking for supernatural explanations for unfortunate but ultimately random tragedies. Fact 3. Director cast his own parents. In one of the most unusual casting decisions in horror movie history, director Rusty Cundiff decided to put his own mother and father in front of the camera for the film's most intense segment about racist violence and supernatural revenge. Both John A. Cundiff and Christina Cundiff appear in the KKK comeuppance story, where racist politician Duke Metger gets his comeuppance from vengeful slave spirits inhabiting voodoo dolls. Christina Cundiff plays Miss Cobbs, the mysterious voodoo witch whose painted portrait dominates Duke Metger's plantation office and who created the deadly dolls that house the souls of murdered slaves. Even though she doesn't have any speaking lines in the film, her presence is absolutely crucial to the story's supernatural elements. Kundieff later explained that directing his mother was surprisingly easy, saying that she was naturally great at looking appropriately angry and menacing when the camera rolled, despite being an introvert in real life. His father John took on the role of the preacher who delivers the eulogy at the funeral of Rhodey, Duke Metker's African-American campaign manager who dies after tripping over one of the cursed dolls. According to Kundieff, his father had actually written out an entire sermon for the scene and was nervous about remembering all his lines. The director had to tell him he couldn't use everything he had prepared because it would make the scene too long, and when Kundieff called action, his father became visibly nervous about performing. The decision to cast his parents wasn't just about convenience or saving money on actors. Kundieff wanted the KKK comeuppance segment to feel deeply personal and rooted in real family history and emotion. Having his actual parents appear in a story about the lingering effects of slavery and racism added an authentic weight to the supernatural horror, making the vengeful spirits feel more like real ancestors seeking justice rather than just movie monsters. Fact 4. Tom Wright's double horror anthology Revenge. Actor Tom Wright holds a unique distinction in horror movie history as one of the few performers to play vengeful ghosts seeking bloody revenge in two completely different anthology films. In Tales from the Hood, Wright portrays Martin Morehouse, the civil rights activist who returns from the dead to punish the corrupt police officers who murdered him, but this wasn't his first time playing a supernatural avenger with a serious grudge. 8 years earlier, in 1987, Wright appeared in Creepshow 2 as the title character in the Hitchhiker segment, where he played a man who gets accidentally killed by a distracted driver and then relentlessly haunts her as she tries to flee the scene of the accident. In that story, Wright's ghostly hitchhiker keeps appearing in increasingly mangled condition, repeatedly telling the guilty driver, "Thanks for the ride, lady," as he pursues her with supernatural persistence. The similarities between Wright's two roles are actually quite striking when you think about them. In both films, he plays victims of vehicular violence who refuse to stay dead and instead return to terrorize the people responsible for their deaths. Both characters also have a habit of clinging to moving cars during their vengeful pursuits, creating some genuinely terrifying moments as they refuse to let their killers escape justice. What makes Wright's double duty as a vengeful spirit even more interesting is how different the two films are in tone and message. Creepshow 2 was primarily focused on delivering traditional horror scares with dark humor, while Tales from the Hood used its supernatural elements to address serious social issues like police brutality and systemic racism. Despite these different approaches, Wright managed to bring genuine menace and otherworldly presence to both roles, proving that he had a real talent for playing characters who simply wouldn't stay buried and forgotten. Fact 5. Spike Lee's first horror production. For a filmmaker who had already established himself as one of the most important voices in American cinema by 1995, it's surprising that Tales from the Hood marked Spike Lee's very first venture into horror filmmaking as an executive producer. Despite having a filmography that included groundbreaking movies like Do the Right Thing, Malcolm X, and Jungle Fever, Lee had never worked on a horror project before agreeing to support Rusty Kundieff's socially conscious anthology. Lee's involvement with Tales from the Hood came through his production company 40 Acres and a Mule Filmworks, which had been championing diverse voices in cinema since the late 1980s. The connection made perfect sense when you consider that both Lee and director Kundieff shared a commitment to addressing racial issues through their art, though Kundieff chose to explore these themes through supernatural horror rather than Lee's typical dramatic approach. What makes Lee's participation even more interesting is how long he stayed away from the horror genre after this initial experiment. For over 2 decades following Tales from the Hood, Lee continued making films across many different genres, including war movies, documentaries, biographical dramas, and even a musical, but he completely avoided horror projects. His filmography during this period included everything from the Vietnam War epic Da 5 Bloods to the Ku Klux Klan infiltration thriller Black Klansman, yet none of these films relied on supernatural scares or traditional horror elements. It wasn't until 23 years later, in 2018, that Lee returned to horror as an executive producer for Tales from the Hood 2, the direct-to-video sequel that reunited him with the original creative team. This makes his early support of the original Tales from the Hood even more significant, as it represents a unique moment when one of cinema's most respected directors decided to lend his name and resources to help bring African-American horror stories to the screen. Fact 6. The soundtrack outsold the movie. In one of the most unusual success stories in movie marketing history, the Tales from the Hood soundtrack became significantly more popular and profitable than the actual film it was created to promote. While the movie earned a respectable $11.8 million at the box office on a $6 million budget, the soundtrack album became a genuine hit on the music charts, reaching number 16 on the Billboard 200 and climbing all the way to number 1 on the Billboard R&B hip-hop albums chart. The soundtrack featured an impressive lineup of established and emerging hip-hop artists, including Wu-Tang Clan, Grav Digaz, MC8, Scarface, Spice One, and The Click, along with several other performers who were part of the hardcore rap and gangsta rap movements of the mid-1990s. Music supervisor Larry Robinson assembled this collection of tracks that perfectly matched the film's urban themes and social commentary, creating an album that could stand on its own as a solid hip-hop compilation, regardless of whether listeners had seen the movie. The album's lone charting single was the title track, Tales from the Hood, performed by Domino and Tha Chill, which reached number 8 on the Hot Rap Songs chart and helped drive sales of the entire soundtrack. The success was particularly notable because soundtrack albums were becoming increasingly important revenue streams for movies during the 1990s, as record labels and film studios realized they could market music to audiences who might never buy a movie ticket. The soundtrack's commercial triumph actually makes perfect sense when you consider that the film's target audience of young urban moviegoers were also the primary consumers of hip-hop music during this era. While the movie had a limited theatrical release and faced competition from bigger-budget horror films, the soundtrack could be played on radio stations and purchased by music fans who appreciated the artists involved, regardless of their interest in horror movies. Fact 7. Dolls recycled for Team America. In a bizarre case of horror movie props getting a second life in comedy, some of the creepy voodoo dolls that terrorized racist politician Duke Metger in Tales from the Hood ended up being reused 9 years later in Trey Parker and Matt Stone's puppet satire Team America, World Police. The Chiodo brothers, who are Charles, Stephen, and Edward Chiodo, worked on the special effects for both films and decided to give their handcrafted dolls from the horror anthology a completely different role in the political comedy. The Chiodo brothers are legendary puppet makers and stop-motion animators who have worked on dozens of films including Killer Clowns from Outer Space, Critters, and Pee-wee's Big Adventure, so it makes sense that they would want to reuse expensive and well-crafted props whenever possible. The voodoo dolls they created for Tales from the Hood were intricate pieces that required detailed sculpting and painting to look like miniature people possessed by the souls of murdered slaves, so throwing them away after filming would have been wasteful. In Team America, World Police, these same dolls appeared in completely different contexts, likely as background props or minor characters in the film's elaborate puppet world. The transformation from supernatural horror elements to satirical comedy props represents one of the more unusual journeys any movie prop has ever taken, going from a serious story about racial injustice and vengeful spirits to a crude puppet comedy about American foreign policy. The reuse of these dolls also highlights how practical effects artists often maintain collections of their work that can be repurposed for future projects. Unlike computer-generated effects that exist only as digital files, physical props like the Chiodo brothers' dolls can have multiple lives across different films, sometimes ending up in completely different genres than they were originally created for, creating unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated movies. Fact 8. Based on childhood trauma, the most emotionally devastating segment of Tales from the Hood, Boys Do Get Bruised, wasn't just a fictional horror story but was actually inspired by a deeply traumatic real-life experience from director Rusty Cundeff's childhood in Pittsburgh. When Cundiff was young, he visited a friend's house who lived down the block from his family home and discovered something that would haunt him for years and eventually make its way into his film decades later. During that childhood visit, Cundiff witnessed his friend's younger sister in a horrifying situation that clearly indicated she was being severely abused. According to Cundiff, he found the girl gagged and hogtied in the basement of the house, a scene so disturbing that it stayed with him long into adulthood. The young Cundiff immediately went home and told his father about what he had seen, hoping that an adult could intervene and help the abused child. However, Cundiff's father, who worked as a detective in the juvenile division of the Pittsburgh police force, felt completely powerless to take action despite his position in law enforcement. As Cundiff later recalled in an interview, his father told him, "I can't mess with those whites," explaining that even with his badge and his official position, he didn't feel he was in a position to deal with the situation because of the racial dynamics involved. This painful childhood memory of witnessing abuse and feeling helpless to stop it became the foundation for the Boys Do Get Bruised segment, where young Walter suffers at the hands of his mother's abusive boyfriend Carl. Cundiff has said that this experience, and perhaps the lasting impact of that moment of powerlessness, gave him a lifelong interest in stories about child abuse and domestic violence, themes that would surface not just in Tales from the Hood, but throughout his career as a filmmaker. Fact 9. Lost Director's Commentary Mystery. One of the most frustrating mysteries for Tales from the Hood collectors involves a director's commentary track that completely vanished when the film transitioned from Laserdisc to DVD, creating one of the more puzzling cases of missing bonus content in home video history. When HBO released the film on Laserdisc in 1995, they included a full commentary track by director Rusty Cundiff, where he discussed the making of the film, shared behind-the-scenes stories, and explained the social themes he was trying to explore through horror. Laserdisc was the premium home video format of the mid-1990s, often featuring extensive bonus materials that weren't available on VHS tapes, and the Tales from the Hood Laserdisc was no exception. Film fans who owned Laserdisc players could listen to Cundiff's insights about everything from the casting decisions to the special effects work, getting a much deeper understanding of how the anthology came together and what inspired each of the 4 horror segments. However, when HBO Home Video released the film on DVD in 1998, the commentary track was mysteriously absent from the disc, with no explanation given for why this valuable content was left behind. This omission became even more puzzling when you consider that DVD technology was specifically designed to accommodate multiple audio tracks and bonus features, making it technically easier to include commentary than it had been on Laserdisc. The missing commentary has never surfaced on any subsequent home video release of the film, including the Scream Factory Blu-ray edition that came out in 2017. This means that anyone who wants to hear Cundiff's original commentary about the film needs to track down an original Laserdisc copy, which has become increasingly rare and expensive as collectors realize it contains content that's available nowhere else, turning what should have been a standard bonus feature into a genuine piece of lost media. Fact 10. Special Effects by Screaming Mad George. Behind some of the most disturbing and memorable visual effects in Tales from the Hood was a Japanese artist with one of the most unusual names in Hollywood, Screaming Mad George, whose real name is Joji Tani. Born in Osaka, Japan in 1956, Tani moved to the United States and adopted his theatrical stage name to help him stand out in the competitive world of special effects makeup, where his surreal and grotesquely imaginative work quickly earned him a reputation among horror filmmakers. Screaming Mad George was responsible for creating the twisted and mangled makeup effects that brought the film's supernatural horror to life, including the ghoulish appearance of the vengeful Martin Morehouse and the disturbing transformation effects that occur throughout the anthology. His work on Tales from the Hood was particularly notable for its blend of realistic gore and fantastical body horror, creating effects that were both believable and nightmarishly surreal at the same time. Before working on Tales from the Hood, Screaming Mad George had already established himself as a master of practical effects through his collaborations with producer Brian Yuzna on films like Society and Bride of Reanimator, where his bizarre and often stomach-turning creations helped define a particular style of 1980s and 1990s body horror. His effects work was characterized by its organic, flesh-like quality and its ability to make audiences genuinely uncomfortable through its realistic depiction of impossible transformations. The artist's contribution to Tales from the Hood was especially important because the film relied heavily on practical makeup effects rather than computer-generated imagery, which was still expensive and limited in 1995. Variety magazine specifically praised his effects work in their review of the film, noting how his creations enhanced the horror elements while supporting the movie's serious social themes, proving that even the most grotesque special effects could serve a deeper artistic purpose. Fact 11. David Alan Grier's dramatic departure. For audiences who knew David Alan Grier primarily as the hilarious sketch comedian from In Living Color, seeing him as the violent and abusive Carl in Tales from the Hood was genuinely shocking and disturbing in ways that went far beyond typical horror movie scares. Greer, who had built his career on making people laugh with characters like the overly enthusiastic fitness instructor or his various comedic impressions, completely transformed himself into one of the most believable and frightening domestic abusers ever put on screen. The casting of Greer was a brilliant decision by director Rusty Cundiff, who understood that audiences would bring their expectations of the comedian to the role, making Carl's violence even more jarring and unexpected. When viewers first see Greer in the Boys Do Get Bruised segment, they might initially expect some kind of comedic relief, but instead they witness a man who terrorizes both his girlfriend Sissy and her young son Walter with brutal physical and emotional abuse that feels disturbingly real. Greer approached the role with complete seriousness and commitment, stripping away all traces of his comedic persona to create a character who feels genuinely menacing and unpredictable. His performance captures the psychology of an abusive partner perfectly, showing how Carl can shift between false charm and explosive violence, manipulating the people around him while maintaining a facade of respectability to the outside world. What makes Grier's performance even more effective is how he manages to make Carl feel like a real person rather than a cartoon villain, despite the supernatural elements that eventually destroy him. The actor brought a level of authenticity to the role that made the abuse sequences genuinely uncomfortable to watch, which was exactly what the film needed to address the serious issue of domestic violence before delivering its supernatural justice. This dramatic turn proved that Greer had serious acting range beyond comedy. Fact 12. The missing doll segment ending. The thrilling climax of the KKK comeuppance segment that audiences love today almost never happened, and the story behind its creation reveals how test screenings can completely change a movie's final form. Originally, the director Rusty Cundiff and his team didn't have the budget or resources to create the elaborate scene where an army of vengeful voodoo dolls swarms and devours the racist politician Duke Metker in a spectacular display of stop-motion horror. Instead, the original version of the segment ended on a much more ambiguous and psychological note, with people simply discovering Duke's body hanging in his plantation office, leaving viewers to wonder whether the supernatural dolls had actually killed him or if he had gone insane from guilt and fear and taken his own life. This ending was intended to be more subtle and leave room for interpretation about whether the supernatural elements were real or just products of Duke's deteriorating mental state. However, when the film was shown to test audiences, viewers found this ambiguous ending deeply unsatisfying and made it clear that they wanted to see the dolls actually attack Duke rather than just discovering the aftermath. The audience reaction was strong enough that the filmmakers decided to go back and spend additional money they hadn't originally budgeted to create the doll attack sequence that became one of the film's most memorable moments. This meant bringing in the Chiodo brothers, the specialist puppet and stop-motion animation team, to create the intricate scene where dozens of tiny dolls come to life and overwhelm Duke in his office. The reshoots required careful coordination between live-action footage of actor Corbin Burnson and the detailed stop-motion animation of the attacking dolls, creating a technically complex sequence that would have been done with computer graphics if the film had been made today, but which has a unique handmade quality that many fans prefer to digital effects. Fact 13. Duke Metker's real life inspiration. The villainous politician Duke Metker wasn't just a fictional creation of the filmmaker's imagination, but was actually a deliberate combination of two notorious real-life white supremacists whose names were merged together to create one of horror cinema's most despicable characters. The first half of his name comes from David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who had attempted to mainstream his racist ideology by running for various political offices throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. David Duke had gained national attention for his efforts to rebrand himself as a respectable politician while maintaining his white supremacist beliefs, running for the Louisiana House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and even for President and Governor of Louisiana. His strategy of wearing suits instead of robes and using coded language instead of explicit racial slurs made him a particularly dangerous figure because he could appeal to mainstream voters while still promoting hateful ideologies. The second half of the character's name comes from Tom Metzger, the founder of White Aryan Resistance, a white supremacist organization that was active during the 1980s and 90s. Metzger was known for his use of television and other media to spread his racist message, and he was particularly focused on recruiting young people to his cause through music, videos, and other forms of popular culture that would appeal to teenagers and young adults. By combining these two names into Duke Metker, the filmmakers created a character who embodied the most dangerous aspects of both men. Duke's political ambitions and mainstream appeal combined with Metzger's media savvy and youth-focused recruitment strategies. This naming choice made it clear that the character wasn't just a generic racist villain, but was specifically designed to represent the real threat posed by white supremacists who try to gain political power and cultural influence through seemingly legitimate channels. Fact 14. Mr. Sims' Terrordome reference. One of the most cleverly hidden details in Tales from the Hood comes in the film's climactic moment when Mr. Sims reveals his true identity as Satan, delivering a line that connects the supernatural horror directly to the contemporary hip-hop culture of the mid-1990s. When Clarence Williams III's character finally drops his funeral director facade and transforms into the devil himself, he tells the three terrified drug dealers, "This ain't no funeral home. It ain't the Terrordome neither. Welcome to hell, motherfuckers." The Terrordome reference is a direct nod to Public Enemy's influential 1990 album, Fear of a Black Planet, which featured a track called Welcome to the Terrordome that had become an anthem of black resistance and empowerment. Public Enemy, led by Chuck D and Flavor Flav, were at the height of their popularity in the early 90s and were known for their politically charged lyrics that addressed racism, social inequality, and the black experience in America. By having Mr. Sims reference the Terrordome, the filmmakers were making a deliberate connection between the supernatural horror they were presenting and the real-world social commentary that hip-hop artists like Public Enemy were delivering through their music. The line suggests that while Public Enemy's Terrordome represented a space of black power and resistance, Mr. Sims' realm is something far worse and more permanent than any earthly struggle. This reference also reinforced the film's overall connection to hip-hop culture, which was evident not just in the soundtrack but in the urban setting, the dialogue, and the way the stories addressed issues that were central to rap music of the era. The Terrordome reference served as a cultural bridge, acknowledging that the film was speaking to the same audience and addressing many of the same social issues that conscious rap artists were tackling in their music. Fact 15. Lamont Bentley's fatal car crash. 10 years after Tales from the Hood introduced audiences to Lamont Bentley's chilling portrayal of the violent gang member Crazy K, the young actor's life ended in a car accident that was almost as shocking and sudden as the fictional violence he had depicted on screen. On January 19, 2005, Bentley was driving alone on Highway 118 near Simi Valley in Ventura County, California, when he lost control of his vehicle in the early morning hours just after midnight. Witnesses to the accident reported that Bentley's car was traveling at high speed when it ran through a stop sign at the Rocky Peak Fire Road off-ramp, crashed through a chain-link fence that was situated across the street, and then rolled down an embankment. The impact of the crash was so severe that Bentley was ejected from his vehicle and thrown onto the busy freeway, where the tragedy became even worse as 5 separate cars struck him as he lay on the roadway. By the time emergency responders arrived at the scene, there was nothing they could do to save the 31-year-old actor, who was pronounced dead at 12:23 in the morning. Bentley had been returning home after attending a film screening, and investigators found no evidence of alcohol or drug impairment, suggesting that the crash was likely the result of excessive speed or a momentary loss of attention while driving. The news of Bentley's death devastated fans who remembered him not just from Tales from the Hood, but also from his popular role as Hakeem Campbell on the UPN sitcom Moesha, where he had played Brandy's loyal best friend for 6 seasons. At the time of his death, Bentley was also pursuing a rap career as part of a group called U-Prize, and was focused on supporting his 2 young daughters, making his sudden death all the more tragic for those who knew him personally.